You're listening to BGU Radio.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and hello to our listeners around the world. And welcome to a very special Ben-Gurion University Radio live audience podcast, coming to you from the beautiful Wertheimer Gallery in the port of Tel Aviv. I'm Professor Simon Barak from Ben-Gurion University, and it is BGU Radio's privilege to be part of the first ever podcast to be hosted in an Israeli gallery, putting the Wertheimer Gallery at the vanguard of art communication. And no artist deserves to be part of this pioneering podcast more than my extraordinary guest and my oldest friend, Daniel Remer, whose solo exhibition, Stranger Than Dreams, is currently on show at the Wertheimer Gallery. Hi, Daniel. It is so good to be with you. You know, Daniel, it's a particular honour for me, as you and I have been friends since we were 3 years old, growing up in Britain. We've made films together, and I've been following you since you started working on these photographs. Actually, I considered myself your number one fan, until Daniel, and I'm sure you'll be happy to know, your wonderful wife, Daphne, she reminded me that she is your number one fan. So I've just been relegated to your number two fan.
Well, it's good to know that.
But I still think that's pretty good though, right?
It is very good.
So, Daniel, this afternoon, I want to delve into what the pieces of the puzzle are that led to Daniel Remer becoming an artist. But before we do that, we are surrounded here by your amazing art. And I thought it would be good if you could describe a bit about your artwork so that particularly the listeners of the podcast can get an idea of what you do. So why don't we start with how you create these photographs, and which actually look more like paintings than photographs?
Well, first of all, I have the image in my mind. I don't find something and think this will be a great picture. I kind of envisage what I want the picture to look like, and then I have to go and start looking for the objects, which I call them props. And that can take time, because to find the exact thing that I want, if I don't find it in a market, then I have to look online. And a lot of them, they come from different countries. And then when they all arrive, I set them up in my studio, and I arrange them in the way that I originally thought how it would look. And that can take hours or days, and that's even before I start photographing them.
So how do you actually make the pictures?
Well, I'm using a technique called light painting, and they look like paintings, you said, but my idea was I don't go out to start making pictures that look like paintings. The fact that they look like paintings is a byproduct of the technique. I mean, I like that they look like that, and I want them to look like paintings, but I didn't start by saying I'm going to make a photograph that looks like a painting. So light painting takes place in a dark room, and all I have is a flashlight, a small flashlight, and I use that to light parts of the image whilst the shutter on the camera is open. So it's a long exposure, and I make many different I take a lot of photographs, lighting different parts of it, without moving the camera.
So you're using the flashlight like a paintbrush?
Yeah.
Wow. So Daniel, the subject matter of your pictures is very special, and each one has a lot of meaning conveyed in the work. And I think perhaps the best way for listeners to understand your compositions would be to describe one of your paintings. So why don't I describe one of your paintings, and then you can maybe tell us the story on the meaning behind the painting. So I'm going to describe one of my favorites, which is called Feeding the Mongoose. And the picture itself shows an open, vintage, brown leather doctor's bag with a cabbage dangling by a string over the mouth of the open bag. So what is the meaning you're trying to convey in that picture?
Well, that picture was inspired by the philosopher and author Alan Watts. But before I explain what it means, I have to first say, feeding the mongoose. A mongoose is a rodent, and it's actually the only rodent that can kill poisonous snakes. And so the snakes are scared of it. So that's an important point. So Alan Watts told a story about a traveler traveling on a train and sitting opposite a strange man. And this strange man, he took down an old bag from a rack over his head. and he opened it on his lap, and then from out of his coat he took out a cabbage on a string, and he started dangling the cabbage in the mouth of the bag like you just described. And I could see this in my mind as I read this story. And the traveler was so curious, he couldn't sit there. So he said to the man, "Excuse me, can you tell me what you're doing?" And the strange man said, "Yeah, I'm feeding my mongoose." And he said, "Well, why are you traveling with a mongoose?" So he said, "I'm an alcoholic and I suffer from DTs, which are hallucinations where you see snakes crawling or things crawling on the ground." And he said, "Well, when I get these hallucinations, I have the mongoose, and the mongoose scares them away." So the traveler, he said, but don't you realize these snakes that you see are only imaginary?" And the man said, "But so is the mongoose." So I heard this story and I thought, well, what does it mean? And to me, the battered bag means like the luggage we carry around with us in life.
Baggage we carry
around. The baggage, literally the baggage we cover around. The cabbage on the string is like the strange tools we use to deal with fears and anxieties. And the mongoose is like a sign of delusion or the things that we use to combat our fears. So really, it's like our struggles are very real, but sometimes our fears and anxieties, which we create ourselves, the tools that we create to kind of deal with them are just as strange as the things that bother us, and we create these things in our mind, and then we create stranger things to try and get rid of them. So I thought it was a very, very good metaphor and very visual.
So if we talk about the visual part of it, from feeding the mongoose, it's obvious from the story that you have chosen objects, why you've chosen those objects in the work. But for many of your photographs, you actually have to stand there and try and understand the meaning of them. For example, and of course you've also got titles which help you try and understand the meaning of them. For example, one of my favorites, actually it's right in front of me, is Father and Son. So for our listeners, this picture shows two vertical rusted pipes touching each other, with the elbow-shaped part of the pipes looking in different directions, and one is placed below the other. And it sort of conveys an intimacy, but also sort of a tension, like father and son, right? And you really feel the emotion. So how do you decide what objects to use to impart a particular message or a particular emotion?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it depends on what kind of emotion and how close I want the objects to get. So, for example, different objects can convey different emotions. Not just the objects, but the size of them, the size of the objects in proportion to each other and the way they're positioned and the angles that they are to each other. So, for example, something like the brushes here. Brushes are interesting objects because you can push them very, very close to each other. Like they become intertwined. There's not many objects that can get, as close as a brush. So they're kind of like people. They represent like the way people can get intertwined. But for something like the father and son, which is more defined, metal, it's hard, and they're not merging together. But it's more with those. It's more about the positioning of them that conveys the love and the affection between a father and son. And then, of course, the size. You see that one of the pipes is much bigger than the other. And as you said, they're facing in different directions because even though they might see the world in completely different ways, there's still a closeness between them.
So when I look at your pictures, of course, one of the things they remind me of is surrealism, right? The surrealistic school of art. But you say that they're not surrealistic. So what are they?
I call them metaphysical. The metaphysical school of art was founded in 1910 by Giorgio de Chirico. This was long before surrealism. And what they're doing is they're using objects and places as symbols, which is very different to surrealism. Surrealism is using dreams and hallucinations and imagery from dreams and painting them without analyzing them, without it going through our logical minds. It's like the basis of surrealism was to take the unconscious and put it on a canvas. And that's not what I'm doing. I'm not interested in that. None of these pictures here are things that I dreamed about or that I had a vision of them. You know, I saw them in my mind, but I planned them out very carefully. And I thought, like, what does this mean? Why do I use this? Why that? So in that way, it really is not surreal. It's metaphysical, which is when the object itself, it takes on a meaning which is completely separate to its function. Like, this pipe. I'm using it in a way which is not the way pipes are used.
Right.
So that's metaphysical. Yeah.
So your pictures, they really deal with existential topics, you know, the human condition, our fears, our hopes, human relationships. And I always look at, for instance, at your picture, the horror of mortality. And I think, blimey, is that what he's thinking about all the time? The horror of mortality? Is it?
Yeah, pretty much. But no, it's not the only thing. I mean, all of my work is to do with similar topics, which are mortality. That's probably the most. But also aging and memory and relationships. But mortality is a big one. I asked you last week, I said to you, what's the longest period that you can go without thinking about death? And you told me, and you said, I don't know. So I said, can you go a whole day? And you said, of course. And that was amazing to me. To go a whole day without having a thought, you know, of your own mortality. So I understood from that. I probably think about it a lot more. I mean, more than at least once an hour.
Once an hour you think about death?
But not in a miserable way, not always in a miserable way. Like if I'm watching a movie, for example, then I'm distracted. So, but unless the movie's about dying or someone dies in the film, I can get through it. But then I'm always going to go back to that. Like, you know, like a bird going back to a nest. That's like my resting place is this awareness. And I can't imagine what it would be like to live without that, because it would be like living in a fantasy world.
So when you go to meet the directors of galleries, for instance, they must think they're going to meet some manic depressive or something.
Well, I never thought of that until last October. I have an exhibition. It's still going in Germany now. And I went out in October to the opening and met the owners of the gallery face-to-face for the first time before the opening, and we were talking. And after about an hour, she said to me, we were not expecting to meet someone like you. She said, we were expecting to meet someone, she didn't want to be rude, she said, someone very, very serious and less happy. So I realized that they had an idea in their minds from the pictures of what kind of person, which, no, it's understandable, but I'm an optimistic person and a happy person.
Thank God.
But also I think I'm very realistic, but there's a side with all these, the darker side and all of these real issues that I'm putting into the work.
All right, Daniel, to sort of finish off in this section, I'd just like to know, why is the exhibition called Stranger Than Dreams?
Okay, so again, that was from a quote by Giorgio de Chirico, who's one of my, a big inspiration to me. He was an Italian painter. As I said, he started the metaphysical movement. And he wrote a quote, and I'm going to read it. It says, although the dream is a very strange phenomena and an inexplicable mystery, far more inexplicable is the mystery and the aspect our minds confer on certain objects and aspects of life. And what he's saying is, yes, dreams are very strange, but what's even stranger than that and more mysterious is the way we see the world. Wow. And so that's really my focus is nothing to do with the dreams. Is to do with, you know, living and human, the human condition and existential things. So that's why I called it Stranger Than Dreams, because, you know, the conscious world and the non-sleeping world is stranger than dreams, right. I think. Well, mine is.
Yeah, I agree with you. All right, Daniel, that was fantastic. And what I would like to do for the rest of our conversation, I'd like to talk about what led you to becoming an artist and to creating these really, really extraordinary photographs. And I'd like to start with introducing to the audience 11-year-old Daniel Remer, who says to an 11-year-old me one Saturday, let's go into central London. I thought to the cinema maybe, or to the famous Hamley's toy shop. No. You say, you want to take me to the Tate Gallery, to London, to see Salvador Dali's surrealistic painting. I had no idea who Salvador Dali was and what the hell surrealism was. So how did 11-year-old Daniel get into surrealism?
Well, it started when I was 10, and I had a cousin visiting England from abroad. She was a lot older than me, and she was a fan of Salvador Dali, and she had arranged to go to the Tate Gallery, because at the Tate Gallery at the time, they had 4 or 5 of the best Dalis in the world, and she wanted to see them, so she said to me, come with. So when I saw them and stood in front of these pictures, I was amazed at first. I'd never seen anything like it, because the style that Dali paints in is very realistic. But what I was looking at was something that I couldn't understand what it was. It was realistic, but there's no words. And I thought at the time, what I need to do, the challenge, I thought that I have to interpret them. I thought that was what the artist wanted me to do.
I remember you sitting me down with Dali's painting Metamorphosis of Narcissus, 11 years old, and explaining to me every little element and what it means. So I remember you trying to interpret these things.
Well, that was later, after I'd read a book.
Oh, okay, maybe. Yeah.
But we bought postcards that time. I bought postcards of all of the pictures and took the postcards home and looked at those.
We used to go back. I remember you taking me back and was buying the slides of their pictures that we could see on some kind of slide viewer.
Yeah, I went back many times, and I think the second time I went back without you, I bought a big book on Salvador Dali, and I used to just sit and look at the pictures and memorize all the titles and try and work them out. I don't think I really worked them out. Mm-hmm. And I found out recently, because now there's lots of interviews with him on YouTube, that he actually said there's no message or meaning in any of his work.
Oh, no.
Absolutely nothing.
I'm devastated.
So, well, I'm not surprised. But
you went back many times,
I
right?
went back many times. I went with my mother, my grandmother, other friends that I had, and even on the first date, I took someone to the Tate Gallery. That was years later.
And how did those work out?
That's another podcast.
So, did you actually ever try to make any surrealistic pieces as a child?
Yeah, when I was 12, I started painting in oil and acrylic, but I was never satisfied with it. I did actually win the school art prize, which I was surprised, because to me it was not good enough. But
the funny thing is, the next year you won the prize for religious studies. So even then you were thinking about existential
I guess
problems,
so.
right?
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. But I was never satisfied with any kind of creative thing that I did then. So I started making sculptures, because I thought, well, maybe I'll make something good that I like. So I made this sculpture of, it was like a wooden branch, and I'd screwed it to a ceramic floor tile with an old tap, a garden tap, and I wanted it to drip. So I melted some lead. And I made drips, and when it dried, I glued it to the tap. And I called it the birth of liquid metal. And this I thought was really good, and that got me into sculpture.
How old were you?
I was 12.
So you were even giving titles to your pieces at 12?
Yeah. But I liked sculpture as well. It wasn't just painting. I was very interested in sculpture.
Well, if we're talking about sculptures, then Daniel, as a child, you really got in. I remember this. You really got into the great sculptor Henry Moore, and you even got to meet the great man. So tell us how you got into his art and how you actually got to meet him.
Yeah, well, he had a big exhibition in Hyde Park in London, where he exhibited his biggest size sculptures, and you could touch them and climb over them. I think there were about 10 of them. And my mother took me there, and I climbed all over them. I took photos of them. I even had a camera back then. I was taking pictures all the time with a little plastic camera. And I loved these sculptures. So that's how I heard about Henry Moore. And then I used to look, there was no internet. I used to look through the newspapers in the back pages every week, which would list all of the exhibitions in London. And I saw there was a gallery called the Fisher Gallery that was exhibiting Henry Moore's drawings and smaller sculptures. I didn't know till I got there that this was not like a museum. This was a private art gallery that represented Henry Moore, and they sold all of these things. I mean, they were very expensive. And they didn't know what I was doing there. They'd never seen a 12-year-old walk in and look around. And it was a very, very snobby place. But they were so surprised that I actually had come into this gallery and was interested in Henry Moore that they started inviting me to private views of other artists. And then I think they did it for PR. Then they would introduce me to the art world and say, this is our youngest collector here. And after getting to know the people in the gallery, one day they said to me, we're going to see Henry Moore next week. You know, we have business with him. Would you like to come with us? So I had to ask my mother. I was 12 years old. So I said, yeah. So they drove me out there. And whilst they were in the meeting, we went to his estate, and I was shown around the estate, which comprised of lots of workshops with sculptures, and there were a lot of people working for him. He was already a very old man, so he made the little sculptures, and people interpreted them into like giant sculptures. So it was like a factory, but I spent hours looking around there. And then after that, I was invited into Henry Moore's house, this old Tudor cottage, and his wife made us all tea. And we sat in the lounge. I sat next to him, and they introduced me to him, and he was talking to me, and he did a little scribble for me on a piece of paper, and it was just amazing.
Well, you must have had what an experience for a 12-year-old.
Well, apparently that house is now a museum, and everything is untouched, except there's a rope, so you can't sit there. Just to think that I sat there with him.
Amazing.
And now people are like walking around looking at that place.
So you said you took photographs of Henry Moore's sculptures. So you were already sort of into photography. Did you like study any photography as a child?
As a child, I always had a camera, a small plastic camera. By the time I was 14, I bought like a proper camera, an SLR. These were all film cameras. There was no digital. And I taught myself, and there were a couple of friends at school, and we all had cameras, and we would go out on the weekends, like taking pictures, usually street photography or something. And then there was a sports teacher in the school, and he was an amateur photographer, but he was really good. And he took an interest, and he said there's a school darkroom, which we didn't know, and he found a key and opened it up, and he started teaching us processing and printing during the lunch hours and setting us assignments. So you know, I built a little darkroom at home where I was living with my parents, and I spent the weekends printing and processing.
You were mainly doing black and white, right?
It was all black and white, but as I got older, there was something in the black and white that I don't know, it wasn't enough for me. So I started using like dyes, photographic dyes, and painting them on, and special chemicals to make different tones, to add a certain tinge of color.
So how old were you when you were doing all this experimentation?
I was about 15, 16, and even 17.
Wow, and you sent some of your photographs of Henry Moore's sculptures back to him, right?
Yeah, I made a series of 6 10x8 black and white pictures of a small sculpture of his, and I sent them to him, and he replied to me.
He wrote you a letter?
He did, and back then it was not a generic reply. He actually, I could tell it was his voice. I'm going to read just a few lines from it. He said, "Thank you for writing to me and for sending the photographs. They will go into my records. I think your photographs are quite good, particularly as it's such a small sculpture."
But that's high praise, Daniel, from Henry Moore, right?
Well, I was more happy that he signed it, and it's got his signature on it.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Amazing. So when you left school, why didn't you go into photography then?
Well, back then, the only photography available was fashion or
like weddings?
Journalism, weddings.
Yeah.
There was no like fine art photography.
Right.
It didn't exist in England at that time. So I just wasn't interested in those things. So I started at the London Film School. I decided to move into film because I thought film would have more scope. You know, there were surrealist films that I'd seen, and so that's what I did.
So you were accepted into the London Film School, right?
Yes, by then I'd built up, you know, quite a significant portfolio of black and white photographs. And I'd never made a film, but...
Not even, you couldn't even use the animated plasticine man one that we made when we were 11?
No, definitely not that one. But I used the portfolio to get into film school. I was 18 at the time, and I was the youngest one there. And I studied film, and ironically, before we could learn like how to use a movie camera, we had to learn photography again from scratch, which was great because it was much more detailed then.
Right.
You know, we learned very technical things.
So let's fast forward a bit.
Yeah.
3 years later, you find yourself working with the great Jim Henson, the inventor of the Muppets. And now you're part of a huge production team on huge sets for films. I think you were actually part of the production team for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right?
Yeah, the very first
Right.
movie.
And when I think about this, I see some sort of connection with your experience with Jim Henson, because with Jim Henson, you're watching him imbue inanimate objects with life, while in your pictures, you imbue inanimate objects with meaning. But the question I want to ask is, why inanimate objects and not people?
Well, I've worked with people for all of my life, as you know, as like when they're in front of the camera, filming people, interviewing people, and also clients, and now I'm really enjoying the quiet of using objects, because you don't have to compromise with objects. You can put them any position that you like, take as long as you like. They don't protest, and it's I don't know. I think I can use objects to express myself better than in any other way.
Why do you think that inanimate objects show emotion better than people?
Well, I think it's counterintuitive, but they do, because our brains are wired very much to notice people and to get kind of caught up in what people look like, what they're doing. So if you see two people in an embrace, for example, most of our brain is processing, who are these people, what are they, where are they from, what do they look like, are they nice, are they, and the other part of our brain might be reacting to the emotion that we're seeing. Whereas if you take away the people and you use like these brushes here, objects, the emotion can come out even more. It stands out more because it's being portrayed by objects. I mean, that's what I find. So I think sometimes the emotions can be stronger,
purer, sort of,
and purer with objects. I mean, that's my opinion.
So we're going to fast forward again, Daniel. And so you came to live in Israel, and you had a successful film company, Remer Vision, making documentary films. But your whole world changed with COVID. What happened during COVID?
Well, I had a very busy film schedule, making films for your university.
Indeed.
And the lockdown, everything was cancelled, and I found myself at home with my 3 little boys, and my wife, being a doctor, had to go to work, longer hours, and it was very, very busy. And after a week, I realized, well, this is going to go on for a long time. And I started reading photography books, not technical books, but the biographies of the great photographers of the 20th century. I didn't really know anything about their lives and who they were, and looking at their work. And that led me to looking online about photography now. And I realized that, well, photography is now an art form. It's fine art photography. Not only is it an art form, it's very popular. There's galleries that are just selling, fine art photography, and museums. And so I picked up my camera and decided to start taking pictures again, also in black and white. Mm-hmm. But this time everything was digital, and I love the digital. I fully embraced the digital technology and started taking pictures of family. And I saw online there's a photographer called David Yarrow, who's from Scotland, and he's the same age as me. And he was a hedge fund manager, and he changed his career about 10 years ago, and he's now one of the most successful photographers in the world. And I listened to a lot of podcasts from him and read a lot about him, and that inspired me. So I subscribed to a magazine called Medium Format Magazine, which is one of the best photography magazines. And I looked in this magazine and I saw these pictures. They were color, but a color I'd never ever seen before. And they were made by a photographer called Harold Ross, who lives in Philadelphia. And I just didn't, they look like paintings. I didn't know, like, how is it possible? So I contacted him through Facebook, and I said to him, do you ever teach people? And he said, yes, but they come to my studio. I said, well, that's not possible, like, especially not now. And he said, well, I could teach you via Zoom, like privately, one-to-one. And I said, well, how long will that take? He said, it depends on you. And I said, well, can we do it in 4 months? So he said, yes, if we do long sessions. So I said, I'll think about it. And I think this is an important point, because it wasn't free. It was, you had to pay for it, and it was a commitment. So I said to my wife, well, what do you think? Is it something? And she said, well, if you want to do it, you should do it. And at this point, it could have gone the other way. If another person might have said, no, it's COVID and there's kids. Well, what do you need to be getting busy? But she said, no, if you want to do it, do it. And I did.
Well, I know you're wonderful. I know your wonderful wife, and I'm not surprised.
And literally, learning the technique of light painting changed my life, because I realized that black and white it always was missing something for me. That's why I think I tried to, color things in the past. But color, I never liked color. Regular color, I just didn't like it. But light painting is very, very different, and it really was life changing.
So, Daniel, I want to round off the podcast and close a circle from your childhood to the present, because the first picture you made using light painting was called Farewell to Surrealism. I've got the picture here. There it is. And it's farewell to Surrealism, and it's the Surrealism that you loved as a child and infected me with a love for it as well. Out of everything you could have done as a first painting, why was Farewell to Surrealism your first picture?
Well, during the lockdowns, I'd done an in-depth study of Surrealism, not, like as a child, just looking at the pictures. I really went into the people who were the Surrealists. And it was founded by André Breton, who was a writer, really. And he based Surrealism on a very, very loose interpretation of a very small amount of Freud's writings. And it was a pseudoscientific movement. It had nothing to do with painting and art in the beginning. And he actually went to Freud very proudly, showing him, this is the manifesto that I've written for the Surrealists based on your work. And Freud was not impressed and basically threw him out. And that was the shaky beginning that it started on, and it gets worse as it goes along. It was the only good thing about Surrealism is that they recognized the genius of Giorgio de Chirico, because if it wasn't for him, there would be no Surrealist
That's
painting.
The father of metaphysical
Exactly.
work, yeah.
I was very after studying the people, the Surrealists, I was very disillusioned by who they were. I mean, it was supposed to be a revolutionary modern movement, but really they were kind of very middle-class, homophobic, misogynist men, and real misogynists. Women were not allowed to join. And they weren't very nice people, and they didn't care about people. And in 1936, Salvador Dali, he made a sculpture which became an iconic image of Surrealism, where he took an old telephone and he put a model of a red lobster onto the handle, and he called it Lobster Telephone. And he declared that the lobster is a Surrealist object. And, nowadays things are very different. You can't turn a living creature into an object. So in my picture, it's you see the lobster is crawled down from the telephone, and he's crawling out of the frame. You only see half of the lobster. Half of it's already out. So it's like the lobster saying, "I've had enough of this. I'm not your surrealistic object." It's farewell to Surrealism. But there's a deeper level to this. I think also, farewell to Surrealism was me saying farewell to that young part of my life that was really into Surrealism, and now like having matured, I mean, I like it, but I've moved on to, different art forms with a deeper meaning.
So, Daniel, we've really sort of come full circle then. But there is one more question that I would really like to know. What does Harold Ross, the developer of light painting, think of your work?
Well, after finishing the course, I was on my own. You have to then go and start making pictures. I mean, he's very encouraging, and he wanted to see, the first picture that I'd made after finishing the course. I already knew by then it was going to be a telephone and a lobster, and I had tracked down the original 1936 GPO black telephone that you see in the picture because I wanted it to look like it was Salvador Dali's sculpture. And I made the light painting, and I sent it to him, and I said to him, could you give me some feedback about the technique? And I straight away got an email back saying, I can't talk about the technique. I'm too surprised at what I'm seeing in front of me, because he has a lot of students, and some of them are very good. They make beautiful still lifes, but they're very, very kind of classical still lifes. And he said, I've never received a picture that looks like this from a student. And I'm just amazed by it. He didn't say whether he liked it or not, but his first impression was just amazement. After a while, he wrote back and he said, it's so interesting. And he gave me some technical feedback. And then the next one I sent him was even a bit more strange, and he really liked that. And he's been enormously encouraging. And we became friends over the last 4 years. And we're in constant contact.
Have you ever met him?
No, I've never met him face to face, but I'm actually going to meet him later this year.
Wow. Well, I would love to be a fly on the wall for that meeting. And I think on that positive note, I want to end the podcast. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you.
And giving us an insight into your amazing journey to your incredible pictures. And I know that's only part of the story, and maybe one day we'll do another podcast on that part of your life. I would also like to thank our fantastic BGU Radio technician, PhD student Eyal Briman, and a huge thanks to Natalie and Gil Wertheimer of the Wertheimer Gallery for taking the chance and hosting this pioneering podcast. Daniel's exhibition Stranger Than Dreams is at the Wertheimer Gallery until the 7th of March, and I highly recommend that you come and see his incredible photographs. And last, but by no means least, I'd like to thank Daniel's wife and their children for all the support they've given to Daniel.
You're listening to BGU Radio.